By early August, the delegates had worked out the basic framework of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and then they tackled some of the smaller details which still were very important and rife with controversy. Gouverneur Morris suggested, for example, that the right to vote for members of the House of Representatives should be restricted to freeholders, that is, to men who owned property, arguing that if you let people who were dependent on someone else for their wages vote, you would then be allowing them to sell their votes, and you would actually give more influence to these wealthy folks. So by restricting the right to vote to freeholders, you prevented that consequence. John Dickinson, one of the great political thinkers of the day, the author of the Farmers' Letters of 1767, arguing against British tax policy, also thought this was a good idea. He considered freeholders to be the best guardians of liberty, independent men who weren't looking to someone else to support them. Restricting the right to vote to freeholders, Dickinson said, would protect the country against the dangerous influence of those multitudes without property and without principle, with which our country, like all others, will in time abound. And at this point, 1787, most of the people were freeholders. They wouldn't object to this restriction. Nathaniel Gorham represented Massachusetts. He was a merchant in Boston, and he said that in Philadelphia, New York, Boston, where there were merchants and mechanics who were eligible to vote, even though they didn't have a landed estate, elections were just as good as in places where only freeholders voted. And as for the future, this gloomy future to which Dickinson and Morris were looking, it is not supposed that the government will last so long to produce this effect. Can it be supposed that this vast country, including the Western Territory, will in 150 years remain one nation? Gorham didn't think it would, and so let the future take care of itself. Gouverneur Morris, though, wasn't afraid. He was looking to the future, and he also knew that by restricting the right to vote, we might open the charge of aristocracy here, that what we're creating is an aristocracy, a government of landowners. Well, he wasn't afraid of words. If there is going to be an aristocracy, he said, it will come out of the House of Representatives. Poorer sorts of folks will get elected to the House of Representatives in order to augment their own wealth, in order to make themselves aristocrats. That's where you will see the aristocracy emerging, not from the people who already are landowners. The time is not distant, he warned, not 150 years. The time is not distant when this country will abound with mechanics and manufacturers who will receive their bread from their employers. Will such men be secure and faithful guardians of public liberty? Will they be an impregnable barrier against aristocracy? No, they'll give away their votes. Merchants and others, so they'll sell their votes in order to enrich themselves or in order to advance themselves. And remember, voting at this time was done publicly. You stood up in a town meeting. So if your employer knows how you were voting, you're very likely to vote the way your employer wants. Now, as for merchants and others, if they value the right to vote, they can buy property. And if they don't value the right to vote, they don't deserve it. James Madison also thought that freeholders might be the safest repositories of liberty, and in the future, he thought, the majority might have no property. Well, what will happen then? Either they will combine together and take property away from those who have it, or, more likely, Madison said, they will become the tools of opulence and ambition, that is, trading their votes or giving their votes to the opulent or the ambitious who know how to sway those who don't have as much as they do. So it seems like the temper of the convention is moving toward restricting the right to vote to freeholders. And then from one unlikely source, opposition came. George Mason, wealthiest man there, owned more slaves than anyone else in the convention. He says, every man who has evidence of attachment to and a permanent common interest with society ought to share all its rights and privileges. So this doesn't simply restrict the vote to freeholders. It's anyone who has a permanent interest, common interest with society. And then he gave 3 examples. Should the merchant, the moneyed man, or the parent of a number of children whose fortunes are to be pursued in his own country, should they be viewed as suspicious characters? Now, I think we can see that these rich guys in the convention, remember, all of them are freeholders. They're not going to lose anything by this. So they would say, yeah, a merchant, a moneyed man, but then a parent of a large number of children. That also is evidence of a common interest with society. Should they be unworthy to be trusted with the common rights of their fellow citizens? A striking defense of the propertyless parents from George Mason. And then Benjamin Franklin. Now, throughout the convention, Franklin sat in the front looking like a sage, and when he had something of importance to say, he would write out an elegant speech and then have someone read it. This is one of the few times when Franklin spoke directly. He didn't wait to write a speech. He gave it right there. And this wasn't Franklin, the sage. This was Franklin, the son of the Boston soap boiler, who had run away from home when he was 16 and pursued his own destiny, living by his wits. Don't insult the virtue and common sense of ordinary people. That's how Franklin began. He pointed out that during the Revolution, American sailors who were taken captive by the British could have gotten out of captivity, could have gotten off of these rotting hulks of prison ships where they were almost certain to die if they would only join the British Navy. But they refused. British sailors taken prisoner by Americans couldn't wait to join the American service. And why was this? It's because these two countries treated common people differently. In England, they were seen as suspicious characters who needed to be kept in their place. In America, they had no place. They could move into any position, as Franklin had done. Using sailors is an extraordinary idea, because the sailor in the 18th century was it wasn't even a rung on the totem pole. Dr. Samuel Johnson said the only men who go to sea are those who cannot contrive to get themselves into prison. And here Franklin is using sailors as the exemplars of those who should not be denied rights in this new republic, not be denied political power in this new republic. And then Franklin said that in England there was a thinking that tumultuous public meetings were dangerous and upsetting. So Parliament restricted the right to vote to freeholders to keep the propertyless masses from agitating and organizing and having tumultuous gatherings. So we're not going to let them vote, and that will keep them out of the public sphere. And then they followed this. Once these people can't vote, well, we will put more burdens on them. They'll have to do labor. They'll have to do road work. They'll have to do other things because they don't vote. So they have to serve in some way. So you begin this process first by extracting them from the public sphere, from political power, and then you begin burdening them. The elected, Franklin said, should never be in a position to judge the electors. So Franklin speaks up for the virtue and common sense of ordinary people and squelches this attempt to restrict the right to vote to freeholders. Thank you.